Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the fourth day, and unfortunately our last day here in Chateau La Maille. We are here for our symposium on artificial intelligence, its cultural, political, and philosophical potentialities. And today we are very proud to welcome David W. Bates. David is a professor in the Department of Rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley, whereas he is also affiliated with the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society. He previously served as director of the Berkeley Center for New Media. He received his PhD in European history from the University of Chicago. His research and teaching focus on the relationship between technology and cognition, as well as the history of political and legal thought. His book, An Artificial History of Natural Intelligence, Thinking with Machines from Descartes to the Digital Age, was published by the University of Chicago in 2024. He is the author of Enlightenment Aberrations, Air and Revolution in France, and States of War, Enlightenment Origins of the Political. He co-edited Plasticity and Pathology on the Formation of the Neural Subject, published by Fordham in 2015. Other publications include articles on topics such as cybernetics, artificial intelligence, and 20th century political and legal theory. So please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you.
And this is his presentation, Political Bodies of the Cybernetic Age. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to Gail and to Warren for the invitation, and to Sarita and Akish for all the support. It's been a real privilege to be here the last few days hearing everyone's talks, and especially on topics that I'm not particularly knowledgeable about, but I think you'll see some echoes today in my presentation with what we've been talking about so far. So I'll start with Reinhard Koselleck, the German historian, and I think we could agree that today in the 21st century, we're also in a decisive turning point and a time of crisis. And what Koselleck famously drew attention to was the link between crisis and decision in life and death circumstances. At all times, the concept is applied in the original Greek to life-deciding alternatives meant to answer questions about what is just or unjust, what contributes to salvation or damnation, what furthers health or brings death. So one of the things that he also drew attention to, though, less famously acknowledged, is that the technology of communication on the infinite surface of the globe has made all powers omnipresent, subjecting all to each and each to all, which I think is a really good definition of the planetary scope of contemporary technology. At the same time, he said, we've seen the opening up of interplanetary space, although the result may be to blow up mankind as well in a self-initiated process of self-destruction. Of course, he's talking about the crisis of atomic weaponry in the post-war period, but that issue is still alive in the 21st century, as well as the question of war more generally in this period. Now, he said these phenomena are linked historically, and they constitute what for him was the post-war political crisis. And as he says, it presses for a decision. Now, that might seem unproblematic in a way, political decision being a common trope in the history of legal and political thought. But as Carl Schmitt, the German jurist, wrote in the same period, decision has become problematic. The human arm that holds the atom bomb, the human brain that innervates the muscles of the human arm, is, in the decisive moment, less an appendage of the individual isolated human, and here he's thinking about the atomic bomb, than a prosthesis, a part of the technical and social apparatus that produces the atom bomb and deploys it. So well before Bruno Latour and others, Schmitt was thinking about the human decision as just part of a larger techno-prosthetic system, and not the origin of, you might say, a genuine decision. So we're living in that age today with the emergence of lethal autonomous weapons. As we know, the US military has been using AI tools in the war against Iran directly. Another headline, Iran war heralds era of AI-powered bombing quicker than the speed of thought, which is to say beyond the human. So this is a real question for us. What happens when decision-making processes are no longer fully under the control of humans? Better understanding is needed for how AI-enabled decision cycles and processes are contributing to miscalculation or inadvertent escalation. We know, for example, that it's possible now that there are decisions being taken autonomously by AI, but even when there's a human decision, it's made in such a short period of time that the information that is gathered from AI is really making the decision. There's really no time for genuine reflection. So what I propose is to think more carefully about decision. So I'll go back to the classic political definition, which is by Carl Schmitt, the renowned and infamous German jurist, from his book Political Theology from 1922. And here he made a famous definition of sovereignty, which is the person who decides on the exception. So decision is quite literally a cutting into a situation, to separate, as it is in German. Well, the exception is to take out from something. So we have here a cutting and a taking rather than a continuity or an evolution. So this is something that Schmitt was developing a lot during his Weimar period texts. A text from the Nazi period is also a very interesting book for this question. Speaking about the Leviathan, he said, the state as a technically completed man-made magnum artificium, a machine that realizes right and truth only in itself, was first grasped by Hobbes. So this idea of the gigantic human. The Leviathan thus becomes none other than a huge machine, a giant mechanism in the service of ensuring the physical protection of those governed. Now we have that famous image of the Leviathan constituted by all of the citizens and wielding the sword and the church at the same time. But there's an important distinction here that we have to look at according to Schmitt. The great Leviathan, as Hobbes said, is but an artificial man, and in which the sovereignty is an artificial soul, giving life and motion to the whole body. So even Hobbes agreed that in the political realm, decisions, the sovereign, was an artificial soul, which is not necessary in mechanism, of course. So as Schmitt pointed out, Hobbes actually transferred the Cartesian conception of man as a mechanism with a soul onto this Leviathan, the state, made by him into a machine animated by the sovereign representative person. So we have the machinery of the state, but still the Cartesian soul as this artificial entity that animates the Commonwealth. Now, what Schmitt paid attention to was the fact that it's the machinic part of government that developed so rapidly in modernity. With the incredible development of the technical means of disseminating communication, information, and weaponry, the power of the state's command mechanism grew in a manner that was astonishing. I think we can take that as an important prelude to the cybernetic age, because this is what cybernetics is about: communication, information, control, command, and the automation of those particular kinds of activities. We see this most famously in the CyberSyn system, which was mentioned earlier in Chile, which is an attempt to kind of automate production, transportation, political decision into one system. Stafford Beer was the designer, and you can see how he was thinking about how to conceptualize political function, which is in a diagram that is almost impossible to parse. There was a Soviet version of this CyberSyn system in the BESM6 computers. What I wanted to look at, though, is a little more closely is how decision was conceptualized within cybernetics. So there's a book that appeared in 1963 called The Nerves of Government, and you can see in the German translation that it's a political cybernetics. Governments are defined as political systems or networks of decision and control that are dependent on processes of communication, and they resemble certain aspects of man-made communication equipment. So there is this cybernetic bringing together of a kind of machinic information processing understanding of what a government is. But to be fair, Deutsch also includes in that diagram, if you look carefully, the process of tentative decisions, and final decisions being made within this elaborate governmental machine. The set of important decision points, is what he calls them, in a system may show a lower or higher degree of concentration. So if decisions are concentrated, it's like the monarchy of absolutist Europe. If it's distributed, it may be a different kind of system. The important thing is that sovereignty is the manifestation of this decision-making power. No outside organization, and this comes from Schmidt pretty much directly, may be permitted to interfere with the working out of internal decision probabilities of the system. Now, Deutsch, despite drawing on the cybernetic tradition here, also leaves open this question of decision as something that escapes the normativity of the sovereign machine. Come to later in the presentation. So critics were having none of this, though. As Heidegger said, man does not hold technology in his hand. He is its plaything. In this situation, there is a complete forgetfulness of being, a complete concealment of being. Cybernetics becomes a replacement for philosophy and poetry. And I think we can see Heidegger as one of a tradition of saying that it's the machinic element of government that in modernity overwhelms the human instead of its emphasis on decision as a human capacity, makes decision part of the information processing system of the machine. And with computers, this becomes obviously highly intensified. So skipping a history of that modernity, we can come to its culmination point, or one of its culmination points, which is the 21st century automatic society, which is what Bernard Stiegler names it, an era, he says, in which calculation prevails over every other criteria of decision-making, and where algorithmic and mechanical becoming is concretized and materialized as logical automation and automatism. And that's in all fields of human endeavor. He says this leads to what he calls automatized confusion in the form of an automatized understanding. The human understanding itself has become automatized, not only of reason in its scientific forms, and we can see this with Chris Anderson and his idea of the end of scientific theory, but will, law, administration, and decision in general, as well as in the military domain, which is extremely important. So as Stiegler says in Automatic Society, no decisions are taken, nor do we arrive at any turning point, any bifurcation. Now, it might seem easy to just go back to a romantic notion of the human as capable of reason, decision, bifurcation, but we're fighting against another, not just a discourse, but a practice, which is the practice of AI and its links with cognitive neuroscience, to eliminate the idea of decision even within the body machine, the kind of information processing system that is the nervous system and brain. This is from Yuval Harari, who we all love to hate. He says, decisions result not from some mysterious free will, but rather from billions of neurons calculating probabilities within a split second. Vaunted human intuition is in reality pattern recognition. So the human mind is not making decision, but just projecting data from its capacity for pattern recognition. So this is linked with the history of AI. As we see in the very first use of this term in 1955, the proposal for the famous summer workshop, the study is to proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. In other words, for all aspects of learning and intelligence to be automatized. So this is a parallel history with cognitive science, where we can just see, even just from the diagram, how mental activity is understood as a kind of automatic process of information manipulation. This comes to the fore in Newell and Simon's work. They worked for many years on symbolic AI, where you can see the direct parallel between the, let's call it the machine of the calculator, the computer, but also the machinic element of the human. The human nervous system and problem solving is entirely analogous to the general problem solver and computer hardware. The elementary information processes, as in cybernetics, are exactly the same. So this is something that we have to take stock of. The idea, as we see from the 1980s, that any scientific theory of the mind has to treat it as an automaton, or you're not being a scientist. This leads to what has been called, with just some irony, the unbearable automaticity of being, which links up with some of the ideas we talked about with zombies, is that we can explain human behavior without any need for anything beyond the automatic activity of the nervous system. So a famous example of this is Daniel Wegner's The Illusion of Conscious Will, where he tried to demonstrate with experiments that the decisions humans make, we actually think of the decision well after the brain has already made the decision automatically in an unconscious way. So the parallels are obvious, and that's what we have to think about today, as sort of segregating and separating and thinking a little bit more about this parallel between the brain and what we call artificial intelligence or cybernetics. Because it's a very strange interaction. We have the brain understood as a neural system leading to artificial neural networks, which is the essence of machine learning and what we call artificial intelligence today. But it's artificial intelligence and neural networks that's now being used to study the brain and to become models for our own understanding, which is a kind of interesting switch. So it's not surprising that in the literature, these are just some examples that I've pulled, LLMs and brains are now being pulled together. But brain science and large language models has a quantum leap occurred. These are, of course, absurdities in a lot of ways, why an LLM would be like a brain, but it is important. So what happens in cognitive science and AI is whatever is possible in AI becomes the definition of intelligence. So as Yann LeCun has pronounced, prediction is the essence of intelligence because prediction is the essence of machine learning. So the famous article on deep learning from 2015, neural networks just use big activity vectors, big weight matrices, and scalar nonlinearities to perform the type of fast intuitive inference that underpins effortless common sense reasoning. Okay, so what I want to do is to think a little bit more about the relationship between human decision and machine decision, because it's too easy, as I said, it's a kind of romantic gesture just to recuperate the human without any problematic consequences, because we know we do live in an era of neuroscience and cognitive science. So we have to think a little bit more about what we mean by the human and what we mean by decision. So I'll start with decision again and back to Schmidt, where he says what's interesting about the decision is it frees itself from all normative ties. So any system that's operating according to norms, habits, algorithms, you might say, is interrupted, cut by the decision that frees itself from the normative tie and becomes, in the true sense, absolute. He calls this the autonomous moment of the decision. And what's important here is that norms are destroyed in the exception, and the autonomous moment of the decision institutes a new norm. That's really what's happening in Schmidt's concept. In the exception, the power of real life, he calls it, breaks through the crust of a mechanism that has become torpid by repetition. So this idea of automatic repetition is interrupted by the genuine decision. Now, of course, it's the opposition between real life, organic life, and mechanism that was put together into one metaphor in cybernetics. And we see an echo of this in Norbert Wiener. The machine, like the living organism, is, as I have said, a device which locally and temporarily resists the general tendency for the increase of entropy. It does this by its ability to make decisions where it can produce around it a local zone of organization. So is this a real decision? Schmidt, again, like Heidegger, would say no. To speak in this context of decisions would be as absurd as if one wanted to take the alternating red and green traffic lights of today's thoroughfares as a series of administrative acts, that is, as decisions. So an automatic system, it's absurd to call it a decision-making system. And we have this kind of escalation of the red light, green light into like autonomous highways and so on. So I'll say that we can, though, again, sort of toggling back into the cybernetic AI world, see a hint of what we might mean by genuine decision. In Turing's famous article from 1950 on computing machinery and intelligence, he likened the computer actually to the cortex of an infant. This is a metaphor that comes up in the earlier text and in 1950. And the cortex of the infant is unorganized, and it has to be organized by interfering with it. In other words, coming from outside to program it, to make it possible to have norms, to have possibilities of action. A human cortex would be virtually useless, as Warren was pointing out, if no attempt was made to organize it. This is the essence of plasticity. But what was interesting for me, and I could talk about this more, is that this is echoed in Turing's very famous work on artificial intelligence. He says when we define intelligent behavior, it presumably consists in a departure from the completely disciplined behavior involved in computation, but rather a slight one. So even for Turing, intelligence was a kind of deviation or interruption of the norms of programming, which is a kind of strange concept, but it shows that this issue is still alive in the post-war period of cybernetics. We can see echoes of this in Gray Walter's work on the brain. He says the power to learn implies the danger of breakdown. So learning is to assimilate something new, which is always capable of destroying what is grounded in the system itself. Ashby theorized this in a great way with a series of articles where he talks about machines breaking down, but breaking down in order to become new machines. After a break, the organization is changed, and therefore so are the equilibria. This gives the machine fresh chances of moving to a new equilibrium, or if not, of breaking again. So the idea is that a machine that breaks down is capable of becoming something novel and capable of what we might call something along the lines of a decision. So this is just another example of the way that this language of emergency and decision and exception filters its way into cybernetics. The concept of a nervous automaton should not only be able to account for the normal operation of the nervous system, but also for its relative stability under all kinds of abnormal situations. Okay, this is important to acknowledge, but I think it's been swallowed by the emergence of contemporary cybernetics. And I think we probably could agree in the 21st century with AI, with Schmidt from the 1960s, that no perfected cybernetic apparatus is capable on its own terms of asking who decides. So this is the premise that we have to begin with, I think, in the contemporary age, is that there is no decision, only prediction. That's what we live with in machine learning. So what is decision? We can further look at this a little more closely with Heidegger. For Heidegger, as we know, we are historical beings, cultural beings, taking in an alien form of thought, which is the thought of historical individuals, and projecting a future, not simply predicting a future from the past, but projecting a future that follows from this givenness in normal situations. Interestingly, in Heidegger, it's technology and its failure that reveals this worldliness, the dense construction of this web of meaning for humans over and above perceptual sense. As he famously describes the hammer, the failure of a tool introduces a gap that becomes a kind of chasm or abyss. In other words, when the tool fails, we realize that the tool is a part of a complex system of historical and cultural knowledge, and that we are, in fact, left alone in this situation with a future that is entirely open. So we recognize that we are not these historical beings. It's not automatic that we behave in a certain way, but we can be interrupted. And this interruption is the space for what Heidegger calls decision, to play on the idea of this breaking or cutting. So the basic disposition of beginning is wonder. We find ourselves in the midst of that which they are not. The other disposition is shock, the abandonment of being itself, and the restraint that is grounded in such shock insofar as it is a creative shock. And this is his description of being in a condition where norms are failing. When we talk of decision, he says, we think of some human act or something carried out, a procedure. But what is essential here, however, is neither the humanness of the act nor the procedural quality. In other words, it's not something that can be automatized. And it's also not something that can be just associated with a kind of natural condition of the human. He says, decision refers to the sundering itself, to this acknowledgement of temporality where past, future, and present are together but not completely reducible to one another. He calls this the open realm. It's an open realm. So this remoteness of undecidability is not a beyond, but that which is closest of the still ungrounded there of Dasein, which has become steadfast in preparation for the refusal as the essential occurrence of being. Okay, that's Heidegger. We can give him some slack here, but it's this notion of undecidability that is really important. As Heidegger said, every decision sounds in something unmastered, hidden, confusing, else it would be no decision. and this comes out in Derrida's work on undecidability as well, is that it's precisely because we have no answer, no prediction, no knowledge, that a decision is necessary. So undecidability is the necessary precondition for decision, or what Heidegger will call an opening, an unconcealing the event. Now, what I'd like to get back to is the relationship of decision to technology. And this is where we can also return to Bernard Stiegler and the ideas that we heard when Nicola was talking about the origin of technology. As a process of exteriorization of our thought into technique, techniques is the pursuit of life by means other than life. So that is the fundamental notion that Stiegler introduces in his text, Techniques in Time from 1994. What he does here is critiques Heidegger and says Heidegger doesn't realize that the historicity of the human, the cultural knowledge, the historical understanding that we have, is conditioned by the artifact, artificial memory, or the tertiary retention, as he calls it. Human thought is technical in its very structure for Stiegler. Temporality emerges from technology because it's an organized, unnatural sequence. So narrative and so on is dependent on our technical understanding. So to exist in Heidegger's gap is to exist in the open space of a technologically determined condition. So therefore, we could say that decision is not human, but rather always techno-human. So this allows us to go back to another tradition within and between cybernetics and AI, which is the discipline of intelligence amplification. This begins with Licklider, his famous work on man-computer symbiosis, where he says we have to think of technology as working with human beings to cooperate in making decisions and controlling complex situations without inflexible dependence on predetermined programs. So it's precisely not about automatization, but about using the computer to make decisions which are always disruptive. So this is what we're talking about, is the interaction. Engelbart, the most famous individual in this tradition, in his Augmenting Human Intellect, also said that technology and language define us as culture. It's what makes us capable of thinking, the external manipulation of symbols. So he called human beings, instead of humans, humans using language artifacts and methods in which they are trained, the HLAM-T system, to make it clear that when we ask ourselves where intelligence is embodied, we're forced to concede that it is distributed throughout a hierarchy of functional processes, rather than located only within the human or within the machine. The development of artificial intelligence has been going on for centuries, which is exactly what Stiegler would argue. So he says quite presciently in 1962, it seems reasonable to consider the development of automated external symbol manipulation means as a next stage in the evolution of our intellectual power. So they were very optimistic in the 60s that computers could be this aid to thought rather than simply its replacement. This is true of Bateson as well, where the computer is, as he says, just the arc of a larger circuit, which includes the human, the environment, and the whole system is what is thinking. It's not just the individual, but the system is what is thinking. So intelligence is, again, the combination of human and technology. Now, the question is, with the overdevelopment of the technical and the swallowing, you might say, of the capacities of the human within this system, is the challenge of the present. So how do we evade automatic normativity of the kind that Stiegler is talking about? How can the mind deviate from these automatic norms that are imposed on it by the digital infrastructure when they condition even our basic experience? And that's, I think, why Stiegler is important. He doesn't just go back to a human. The human is always technical, so there's always an element of this machinic in the human. But how do we deviate from the automatic as a whole is the question that we have to ask. So for Stiegler, he's deviating from Heidegger, and because he wants to think about technology, but he goes back to Heidegger to say, when we think as an individual living human body in a complex socio-technical kind of system, there's always something unpredictable that happens. So when thought stored in tertiary retentions or artifacts becomes reanimated in a body, this living moment is a kind of event which is not entirely predictable. Now, what is pathological, the digital, is that unfortunately it short circuits that living event by direct manipulation of the nervous system. And this is a kind of a footnote to Warren's paper yesterday. So all memory becomes integrated. This is what is important for Stigler, is that there's an elimination of inconsistency and error and no unpredictability and no bifurcation. The destruction here then is of the genuine decision as an anticipation of something that is imagined but is not yet, and not simply a prediction from data. So Schmidt talked about this, I think, in his own way in 1950s. The new Leviathan is an objective autonomous eminence which infinitely exceeds the narrow physical, intellectual, and animating capacities of its individual human inventors. So this is the challenge. Now, when we look at what LLMs are, and I think this is kind of an absurd model for brains, humans, decision-making, they basically just predict words in a sequence and learn patterns and generate language that follows those patterns. So that seems benign, but what I want to end with is this idea that predictions get concretized. So especially in what's called analytics, the prediction often turns into a reality, and it doesn't get a chance to fail. If we know, like from famous examples of the early smart weapons, the prediction that there's an enemy there becomes the death of an enemy simply because we've decided already that the enemy is there. And this is repeated, obviously, in the history of drone warfare. The Reaper drones, at least, are piloted by humans, but now we have AI combat drones as example of use in Gaza in November of 2023. We have what are called autonomous lethal weapons designed precisely for no human intervention. This is also true in China with new Anduril small drones and automatic drones that are precisely, again, designed not to have human operators. And this is seen as a selling feature of these new technologies. Algorithms on board the kamikaze drone can maintain terminal guidance and enable the weapon to hit its target, even if connectivity with the human operator is lost during an attack, according to company officials. So the selling feature is that we don't need to make decisions, the AI is going to make the decisions. So with the help of apparatuses, we calculated numbers and numerical sequences that surpass the capacity of the human brain. It's acknowledged today in the universe of military technology that these calculations do surpass the capacity of the human brain and should be making the decisions. So this is where we can sort of look to Stigler as someone who can give us an example of an alternative. Reticulated society, he says, is dependent on this notion of automatization because fiber optic computer information processes operate at up to 2/3 of the speed of light, quicker than Zeus's lightning bolt. So I'll just skip that and say, what does it mean to live in this world where information is processed and travels at speeds greater than the human, and now with machine learning and AI, with parameters that are into the billions and trillions. From technically enhanced coercion and technically enhanced control, there emerged new forms of novel thinking. This is what Schmidt wrote in the 1940s. What would it mean to say that the human is capable of novel thinking in this era of automatization? Stigler goes back to the idea of the decision. A decision slices into becoming, becoming being the word for like the evolution from the past into the future, the prediction of machine learning, that carves into it in order to carve out a future that is a protension that is desirable and that would not be reducible to becoming. Projection assumes a project. It's not just prediction, but it assumes a project. And if it's reduced to calculation, it means there is no longer, strictly speaking, an opening to the future, to the extent that it would be essentially indeterminate and as such strictly incalculable. So for Stigler, it's this zone of the indeterminate and the incalculable that we must enter into in order to disrupt automatization. And for him, it's not, again, a return to a romantic notion of the human. It's precisely our technical nature that can be the aid to this process of resistance to automatization. The passage from psychobiological automatic selection to its disautomatization as decision is possible only when organic organs, in other words, the living beings of a human body, combine with and form a system with the technological or organological organs that are tertiary retentions. So it's that interaction between the biological and the technological that defines us as humans, but that we have been in some ways alienated from with the artificial reticulation of our memory. So the cerebral organic matter of the human brain has the precise characteristic, and this again looks back to Warren's paper, of being constantly disorganized and reorganized by the practice of artificial organs composed of the organization of inorganic matter. So this is really what Stigler is trying to argue, is that the disorganization of a living being is what allows us to think about the disruption of automatization. To choose means precisely to disautomatize, that is, to create what Gilles Deleuze called a bifurcation. And this is a mathematical representation of bifurcation. And that's where I will end with the last slide, is that Stigler wants us to think of the noetic, the intellectual, thinking itself, as this power to disrupt, to interrupt, and to disautomatize, that is, to change the rules, or what Schmidt would say, to destroy the norms. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. What a great presentation, David. It really tied together so many of the prior presenters' lectures as well. So really wonderful way to tie it all together. Do we have questions? Okay, Fulvia.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. This is fascinating. I just want to come back to Heidegger and the way he has been used as a model for, thinking, especially his idea, thinking AI, especially his idea of usefulness, of Zuhandenheit, ready to hand. Because what Dreyfus was saying in the paper that I briefly quoted the other day is that there is still a system of values in what we find useful. There is no objective usefulness. And I think this is the question that you are raising. And as an artist, of course, I can't help thinking that the fact that, in Seinenzeit, you have this ready to hand, is translated to Handenheit, and then you have the ready-made that is born like more or less 10 years away from that. And the ready-made is precisely depriving an object of its usefulness and giving it other values that are, exhibition values, thinking value, existential value. It's the mystery of the artwork that actually Heidegger himself, in the question of the technique, says it will help us understanding what the technique is about. So yeah, often when you read Heidegger, it's like, yeah, the technique is not about the technique, and you're like, what is he actually saying? But I think the question is the question of the useful. What is useful if it endangers the human species, if it endangers our capacity to think, if it endangers the planet? It's not a philosophical question, it's a practical question. And what are the system of values that are behind thinking of machines that can endanger us? That's where I tried to get with my paper, and I think you did it much better with yours, obviously, but I think it's a fundamental question that we find ourselves in with the data center. Just
Right.
wanted to have your take on this.
That's really interesting, because it means that
Yeah, this would be better for the online viewers.
I think this is a really, really great comment, because it points to the idea of art actually as operating in that chasm or abyss where we recognize our historicity, but we know that we're not the historicity, and that we are responsible for ourselves. So this whole idea of care in Heidegger is, I think, really linked to his notion of art. But I think what you point to, which I didn't emphasize enough, is that the decision is something that will institute new norms or new values. And so that genuine decision in the political, cognitive sense obviously has an aesthetic and artistic analog that is really important. Or you could argue is even more important in that it gives, as you say, gives value to our political and social life. So I think that's a really great comment. Thank you.
Yeah, just to get back on that, the history of the state of exception and the resetting of the norm and the resetting of the obvious and what is in the habits of people and in the political coexistency and the values, again, yes, that are included, implicit in what we shouldn't do or we should do, the evil, the good, and what is acceptable, like Foucault calls it the threshold of the intolerable. In these years, we have seen so much technology-assisted destruction of these norms of living together, of these human rights, as a way of regulating the, let's say, the cybernetic order of the planet. So that's another question that I think is crucial and fundamental. All right, the drones can save human lives because they can kill without killing soldiers that are sent to kill, but what is the point in killing people, and why are they getting killed, and why are we getting so good at that, and we still don't have the cure for cancer? So I think the fundamental question is that, yes, there always have been technologies of the self. We're not subjectivities biologically born the way we are. There's always been technologies of the self. I think Preciado is excellent at explaining how also gender is a technology and all of these things, but also desirability is a technology, and this techno-fascism that we see is a science of arousing a desire of bloodthirsty people, racist people, a disaffection, a disinvestment, a defunding of living together as a real goal for humanity. And I think this is what AI is strongly assisting by promoting isolation and social incompetence, because there is no Gemeinwesen without social skills. So sorry to insist.
No, I agree completely, and I think that's the whole basis of another exploration. But Stigler makes the same point, is that digital infrastructure disenables the kind of social, what he calls trans-individuation, where we learn as human beings from other human beings in a social setting with values, with norms that change in moments of exception, but are still instituted by us as a collective. So all I can say is thank you. That's just I really agree with everything you say, and that it's the fascination with the technical that is the problem, not the technical per se. As Stigler would say, it's a pharmacological relationship. The poison and the remedy are kind of unstable within the technical. Thank you.
Lauren, can you come up if you can ask a question for the online viewers? You can use the mic.
I'm really kind of just
Thank
making
you,
a quick
Fulvia.
comment. I'm not really saying anything.
Well, no, just come up here so the online viewers can see.
Well, I think it's relevant to what you're saying is that it's about the insecurity of human thought, that we are in a situation now where we give the machine the superior right of the solution.
Right.
That is, for me, the key.
Yeah.
That we have lost we have lost our confidence.
Yeah, or even responsibility, right?
Totally. Yeah. And that goes to what Nicholas was saying.
Yeah, it's a really nice echo there between the.
Were you going to say that?
No, absolutely not. But it's you're making a absolutely right comment. I should come here. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys, but we do have online viewers.
Okay.
We'd love to see your beautiful faces behind
Okay.
the
Well,
question.
after a few
Instead of the disembodied
beaten by the
voice.
heat and.
Sorry.
Yes. First of all, absolute fantastic. I really enjoyed it, and I had a few questions. The first is we talked a lot about cybernetics, and as a person who's been interested in computer science, I'm also interested in early computers, and a lot of the thinking that happened at the time was based at a time where there are large, centralized computers. I mean. Including with Doug Engelbart and the idea of, I like the idea of the tension between McCarthy replacing intelligence and Engelbart augmenting humans. Mm-hmm. I've always been on Team Engelbart, just to precise that. But at the moment, I'm actually fascinated by autonomous, non-human collective intelligence, meaning drones that would basically emerge and live in a very random way as would a flock of birds. And one of the questions I have is that we are now moving from super centralized environment that concentrated the information, the data, where humans could actually have the power of, saying, I'll at least believing we have the power to understand and construct all these systems, to something more decentralized. You can see that with autonomous agents, with drones that are basically agents with wings. And we are entering in a world where basically this non-human collective intelligence is going to start to emerge. And I wonder if you think that, first extrapolation, what would you think these thinkers who've been in the early days of cybernetics would actually think? Do you think they had predicted that? And does it change the paradigm on which they were operating? That was the question mostly I had to you.
That's a good question. I mean, the question of the autonomous, decentralized drone has this pharmacological possibility as something open and interesting and also coordinated and deadly at the same time. But your point is that the intervention is not possible anymore in centralized nodes or even distributed nodes. It's actually even far more distributed. The only thing I would say about the collective intelligence is the question of intelligence. I really would dispute that this is collective intelligence. It obviously depends on how we define intelligence, but the way I'm trying to define it is this process of interruption, disautomatization, the bifurcation, the projection, things that are cutting into knowledge and opening up new pathways. This seems to me to be completely impossible on the machine learning LLM framework. I think it's literally impossible because they are only prediction machines that swallow and digest the errors into another prediction rather than being interested in, for example, errancy as a productive pathway. So that's my only concern, is how do we deal with these collective intelligences in a way that opens it up to our own intelligence, which is in some ways at odds with these new developments.
And we have another question.
Thank you so much, David. It was really fantastic and also so related to my current research. I'm working on a major project about decision-making, collective decision-making, especially. Yes, I don't know if you were there already when I was presenting here, but I'm specifically interested in this part of your lecture in relationship to questions of alien thought that you mentioned briefly. And obviously this question comes up in relation to interpretability of LLMs and the idea of this kind of black boxes and the incalculable, indeterminate that you mentioned. And, the question of how has this changed? Because you only mentioned it briefly, but it would be really interesting if you could talk more about how this idea of the territory of the incalculable, uncomputable has changed throughout history of thought, and also thinking about non-Western approaches to this question of decision making, because I think that this is the direction in which I'm personally going right now. That obviously AI is constructed based on this kind of Western history of logical thinking, and also cybernetics is the way we know it, kind of Western thought, but there have been actually various systems of like recursive, distributed kind of thinking within non-Western cultures, both in China, in ancestral technologies in Africa, and so this also interests me of whether you looked into it as well. And lastly, questions of error. You brought it up briefly, but I think it's also interesting to think about it, like historically, how the questions of something that also interests me. How the differences between various systems in which how in artificial intelligence errors are things that have to be eliminated versus errors as an asset, as something that can be folded back in a creative way, which is what, for example, distinguishes art. That is a domain where an error can become an asset, and precisely we should look at errors and not discard them. So these are questions that interest me.
Yeah, thank you. That last point is really interesting, and a lot of my work is trying to rethink error in those terms within cybernetics and AI, but also to critique them because of this ultimate failure with contemporary AI to think of the error as simply a mistake to be eliminated, as you say. And this is really important politically when you think about deviance and the abnormal and so on. It's really important to think of it as you say, as an asset, not as something to be eliminated.
As in biology, like in
Exactly.
biology,
The
a
pathological.
mutation, a random mutation can be recognized as an asset. But also an important comment on that, the way that, for example, synthetic biologists like Stuart Kaufman or others today are thinking about this question of interpretation of error as an asset is that it doesn't necessarily happen immediately. That this idea of like a niche that can be occupied, that something is only recognized as an asset
Later.
much later, millions
Yeah.
of years later. There is no way in expressing this currently with these computer systems, this kind of delayed applicability of something, or the exaptation that Warren also was talking
Yeah.
about. That
No, I think that's absolutely right. So what I tried on the non-Western thinking, since I'm not an expert in any of it, what I tried to do is leave open with this kind of work a notion of reason and intelligence that is precisely not the logos of Western philosophy, but trying to open up new concepts around bifurcation and recursion, and so that don't fall into the trap of what Heidegger calls inframing. That's my only gesture, but I think you're doing the work that needs to be done, which is to say, on the practical level, what does it mean to have different ways of thinking that disautomatize? So I would just say I try to at least leave open that space, but I don't feel comfortable enough saying anything about, I don't want to say something just trite about another system of knowledge. But I think that the point is taken. It's really important.
Can I briefly give a little...
Could we possibly hear us reading online?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, so these are fascinating questions. We have Hito, Steyerl waiting online.
Oh, so we should
So can we
wrap up.
come back to this fascinating
Absolutely.
line of questions?
Yeah.
But let's give
Thanks
a big
so much.
hand to
Thanks.
David. And
I
to
also draw attention to Gustav Metzger's work on monodestructive parts.
Ah, interesting.
Metzger, monodestructive parts.
we will come back to a question and answer period after Hito, because this was fascinating and we want to come back to
There's
it.
a menu on the bottom of your screen, and the microphone's on the far left. And there's a little arrow next to it, and if you click on it, you can choose where the audio comes into the stream.
Okay, everyone, we now will welcome Hito Steyerl.
It's okay.
Okay, so now it won't echo.
Yeah, no, it really echoes with what you were doing, I know. I see the connections. Yeah, absolutely.
The sound has to go out there.
Mm-hmm. We're good now. Hito, we're ready for you to begin.
Okay, so I'll just launch. I have no idea if anyone can hear me or what's going on. Essentially, I'm lost in space, as you can see. I was badly affected by the heat wave, which means that I'm not able to be with you. I'm very sorry for that, but in part, my talk will also address the question of what happens when parts of you are being left behind by the relentless acceleration of neurocapitalism. I have zero feedback.
Oh,
I don't
Hito.
Yeah.
Here, sorry.
What is it?
We're still getting an echo on this side, so we have to fix it. Do you have many windows open?
Yes, I have many windows open since this is Google Meet, and it's apparently not possible otherwise, but I don't have any echo. It's not on my side.
There's no way that sound is getting feedback.
We're muted on our end, so could you try using headphones? Is that possible?
I will try. It will take a while though. It's not on my side.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are now going to have a presentation from Hito Steyerl, who is a filmmaker and moving image artist born in Munich, based in Germany. She's a writer and innovator known for essayistic video installations that critique digital capitalism. Today, she will present art in the age of authoritarian chatbots. So let's give her a big hand.
Yes, as I said, I wanted to talk about things, about the sensation of what it is. I do a recursive execution of the capital, and this is what's happened now, launched in space and lost. Anyway, I'm going to go through the presentation once that I should just go with the latest thing I have and not make it any simpler. So I will basically throw things at you which are extremely they only have been 2 days ago, is exactly where we're at in our research process. And this is the kind of talk which maybe if I can see the slides, it's this kind of
Say, so somewhere that I should go, and then unmute it. We'll unmute it as soon as you're ready to go. You ready?
Yes, what do you want now?
Unmute it.
Hello?
Unmute it.
Hello, hello. I switched the microphone off now.
Good.
Got it. Yay, we got it. Thank you. Okay, we're ready. It's all good.
So you want me to start again?
No, it's just yes.
That would be better. Thank you.
Okay, I don't really know what to tell you now. This is a presentation that includes some of the newest results we have in our process of investigation. I have no idea whether any of this is coming through to you or not. I will now just simply talk into the void and hope for the best. So the image you're seeing on the screen is something that emerged in our training process of foundational generative model a few days ago. And since it was made without the help of any language embeddings, it has no name. Since it has no language, I have an inkling of what it could be about. And I can already tell you that this is kind of the distillation of a public space, or what Warren might call the neural commons. And this appeared after many rounds of distillation and compression and filtering, training, compressing, again decompressing. And I will come back to this image later. But here's a disclaimer. All of this is very new. It might still be completely riddled with mistakes and errors. I might need to go back on any of those. We have a saying in German, nehmt es nicht für bare Münze, which means don't take it as a naked coin, which means it may not be the full truth. And I'm not trying to deliberately misguide you, but I'm just saying all of this is in process. And this is the contrary of how generative usually works, because most people think that generative AI makes things visible. You enter a prompt in a field, and then you hit a button, and then an image or something else appears as if by magic. But I would like to argue that, of course, a lot of things are also made invisible by the same hitting of a button, which is basically the whole system, all the elements, all the modules that get activated in this kind of generative process, none of which, of course, appear. Labor, meaning annotation of images to train machine vision systems going on in refugee camps in the MENA region. This was something that was big during the early days of the, or shortly before the pandemic. It started and it stayed active during the pandemic. Young people, mainly in refugee camps, were identified as ideal target audience for data corporations to exploit because they were young, they were digitally savvy, and they had access to smartphones. So there was a lot of infrastructure deployed to make that happen, which also arrived to the camps in the Kurdish regional government region in North Iraq. The people that are living in these camps, and there are quite a few of them, are people which were displaced by the Syrian war more than 10 years ago, and have lived in these camps ever since. Some of these camps are now more similar to small cities. They are not tent camps anymore. They have developed into their own kind of urban centers, yet they are far away from any city center. They are hard to reach. There are few employment opportunities in there, and so on. So basically the film that I made, and I'm not trying to show it to you now because I don't know how this system will work or whether it will work at all, is basically a documentary. It starts off as a documentary talking to the micro workers who basically annotate images for machine vision in those camps. They will mainly work for autonomous mobility systems, meaning they have been tasked to tag images of traffic, for example, traffic cones, pedestrians, cars, traffic lights, and so on and so on. And then slowly the whole machinery, the whole imagery morphs because generative AI starts interfering into the generation of the image itself. And content-wise, it also turns out that the machine vision systems were developed, of course, according to the tagging of the images. But then the machine vision systems were integrated back into drones to find targets. And of course, there are many drones flying over that territory at any point in time. And at that time, we interviewed a Kurdish journalist from a local TV station whose car got hit by a Turkish drone and burned. Two of his colleagues, unfortunately, didn't survive the attack. So basically, the people were training machine vision systems. The machine vision systems were integrated into UAVs that targeted other people in the same region, and now even more drones. Basically, all the drones of everyone involved in the recent US-Iran conflict, everyone involved in there is flying over the territory and shooting at people down there. So, as I said, I don't want to show you any excerpts from that video right now, but this is maybe just to hint at the larger political economy of machine vision, and all the workers that were involved in that process have been fired in the meantime, because of course now there is auto captioning systems. You don't need human labor anymore to do any of that annotation work. But of course, there's also other things which become invisible, except that kind of labor context, which is basically the fact that almost all of the chatbots that many people, including myself, use for coding or for generating just anything, that they are inextricably tied to war economies. One example, of course, is Anthropic's chatbot Claude, which is integrated into Palantir's software Maven, which managed at the beginning of the Iran war to somehow misidentify on the base of incorrect data a target for a missile, which ended up being bombed. It was a school in a town called Minab. There were more than 100 school children killed in that attack. And basically, this is also the military strategist and General Karl von Clausewitz. And he said that friction is something that you overlook at your own risk, because friction is, as he says, the thing that separates war on paper from war for real. What is friction? Friction is just the annoyingness of the physical world. It is weather, it is mud, it is, as he says somewhere, the feeling of walking underwater, because on a paper map, of course, you can quickly go from A to B, but in real life and in real war especially, there is always something that doesn't work. It's the horses that are tired, or communication that doesn't arrive, or the socks are wet, or God knows what. But this is friction, and as a general, and Clausewitz is this kind of realist, you are very ill-advised to ignore friction, because this is what essentially decides the outcome. So making friction invisible is kind of a tendency in current machine learning systems. And I also said that potentially, or I mean, as we can expect, many, if not most, machine learning systems, big ones, are intricated with war economies. So what can we do about it? And that's basically the newer part of the work, that one that tries to actively invert many of the components which I mentioned until now. And we actually, my collaborator is called Volker Möllenhoff, and we have embarked on this research project together, following the example of a scientist and philosopher called Otto Neurath, which you may know from Philosophy of Mind, the Vienna Circle, and the logics, for example, contexts such as this. But I am seeing him from a completely different perspective, namely the perspective of war economy, because this is what Otto Neurath studied initially. He was a specialist for war economies. He studied the Balkan War before World War I, Habsburg Empire, and he became very fascinated by war economies because he was a socialist, and he thought that war economies are basically already halfway to socialism, because the economy is centralized already. It is organized in war. The supply chains are organized. The prices are controlled, and so on and so on. So you just have to take away the war. You have to subtract the war. You have to subtract private ownership from this kind of apparatus and socialize it. And this is why he thought that war economies actually are not a bad idea. You just have to push them further into socialization. And what we kept from it is basically this idea of subtraction. Subtract the war economy, subtract exploitation, subtract extraction, subtract also energy waste. So the question became, how many things can you subtract from a machine learning system, a machine learning model? And what happens then with this substrate, with this distillate, with the thing that remains, with the residue? What is it that it is showing us? What is it anyway? But I'm not sure whether I have any answer for these questions. It is an ongoing process. But what we're trying is to subtract as many exploitative and extractive elements as possible from the process and practice of machine learning. And the question is, will something like a social form emerge from this kind of machine learning formalism, or one could even call it machine learning minimalism? And so what is the project? The project is called Lossy, and we are, Volker and I, are training a machine foundational image generator from scratch. Meaning it is not an embedding, it is not a fine-tuning, it is not a GAN, it is a full-fledged image generator like a Flux model, only that it is a Pixart alpha model, which is trained from scratch. And the first step of subtraction is that it is trained on only public domain Creative Commons data. So it is not trained on expropriated, looted data as basically any other or almost all other foundational models we know. And this first step was actually made possible by two colleagues of ours, which are called Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst. They assembled this repository, which is called PD Extended Public Diffusion. Still, and we are getting closer to it, is to try to turn many of these steps into green ones, meaning that subtract extraction and expropriation. And we are currently, honestly, we are already at the lowest rung of this ladder, and we even have eliminated this orange part. So our pipeline is now fully green. But this is, in a way, very trivial. I think it's much more important to focus on the things that also happened during this process, which we didn't expect and which were really fascinating, which mainly have to do on the first layer with the reduction of energy. So first of all, we found out that simply by changing the architecture from, let's say, a Flux model, which is now state of the art in image generation. If we change that to a Chinese-based Pixart alpha model, we were already able to save up to 80% of energy expenditure in training and about 2/3 in inference. So basically, just by, modifying the architecture a little, and maybe taking into consideration, a sort of 10% decrease in performance, whatever that means, we were able to reduce energy by a lot. And there were many, many other steps that we took and almost discovered by coincidence. For example, trying to swap out so-called learned algorithms with what we call pure math on many of the pre-processing and filtering steps, which also gave us very surprising savings in energy expenditure. So basically, we came up with something which is going to run on consumer-grade hardware. The final size is estimated to be around now 9 giga, as opposed to, I don't know, 60 or more of bigger models, and something which is much less or much more energy efficient than other models. So these were all basically findings that we almost made by coincidence, because we weren't really looking for them. We were just trying to subtract as many things as possible, and we still are. But it also turns out that this has side effects, which, you know, considering the weather and so on, may not be entirely unwelcome. So, let me just see, where am I now? Yes, so energy, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay. So the result, I mean, this is a result of many weeks ago, is not necessarily the most recent one, but what I want to tell you is that our model, lossy, is deliberately quite shitty. It is not in any way comparable with, I don't know, Veo or other commercial image generators that aim for photorealism. It doesn't have a photorealism training base. It's very painting heavy, as I said, but also we consider it as a sort of portrait of the public domain or of public space, because it is only trained on public data. And I think that a portrait such as this one, which you can see, can be seen as a portrait of the public domain in a state of dilapidation and conscious neglect. It is a realistic portrait of the public domain today, which is quite ruined and which has been ruined for the past, in the Western European countries, 30, 40 years easily. It may not have existed in other places in the first time. But I think all these creatures which appear, which have bad teeth and which look as if they need to go to the dentist very urgently, I think that these are really very faithful portraits of the state of the public domain today, which is in a state of neglect, which has prioritized extraction over, let's say this is a data producer here, over the fair remuneration and reproduction of the labor power of this potential data producer. So now he is in a bad shape, or this person is in a bad shape, needs to go to the dentist, and does not look as smoothly and frictionless as many other photorealistic creatures you would find on commercial extractive image generators. The public domain, of course, is also devastated by anti-social media, by bubble politics, bubble publics, by funding cuts, by conspiracy theories, by censorship, very frankly, right-wing attacks on science and journalism, and loss of artistic freedom. So all of this somehow manifests in those portraits, I think. So what does this mean for our model? What does it mean for the entanglement of art and war and friction, which I have been talking about? First of all, that we are trying to bring art back into the process, but in a very different way than the corporations, because corporations think that art comes into the process by automating creativity, which is, I think, by now entirely possible. It's not a problem, machines can do it. But art also traditionally has other vectors, other components, which are not being taken account of in this idea of corporate creativity. Namely, it is the idea of responsibility, because this is another thing that artists have been asked to do traditionally and relentlessly, and I can attest to that, that basically artists are asked to take responsibility for every miniature formal decision that they take. So I would be asked, why did you choose this angle, this frame, this cadrage, this perspective, etc., especially when I didn't even know that I ever had made that decision. But this is what art and artistic discourse was about, to take responsibility for formal decisions. And this is the part of art that we want to highlight in our process, that we consider all the technical decisions we make, aesthetical decisions, formal decisions, which we want to take responsibility for in the way that artists usually take responsibility for. And let's just go back to the previous examples. The school in Minap that was bombed by some sort of corporation of Claude and bad data and Palantir's Maven. This is something where responsibility is diffused across all sorts of different layers. You know, no one is responsible. It was the AI, it was the system, it was the bad data, it was a bad hair day, it was whatever. But at the end, more than 100 children are dead, and no one really can pinpoint any responsibility and attach it to anything. So basically, the idea of art that we want to highlight and strengthen is art as responsibility and not art as automated creativity. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as I said already, the idea of subtraction. Our artistic process consists in taking away as many elements as possible from the machine learning process. In the beginning, extractive ones, exploitative ones, then layers of energy waste. But we are really curious how far we can take it. And if we go back to this slide here, there was one element here which we didn't have any sort of procedure for, to do it in a sort of non-proprietary way, and that was the layer of language embeddings, language encoding and decoding. And then we said to ourselves, okay, let's do something entirely without language. Let's encode an image model. Let's train an image model, diffusion transformer, which is not accessible via language, which basically develops its own features, its own mechanisms, its own priorities, and let's see what happens. We will not be able to access it via language. You cannot prompt this thing, right? So we leave it basically to itself to deal with whatever data are in the public domain, and then we see what happens. And I can, of course, go into the technical process, but maybe it's a bit too complicated for this kind of weather. So I will just skip this process of distillation, of leaving basically the process to itself and self-distilling. Now I come back to my previous slide at the beginning, the title of the talk, which has no name, but which is this round object, which you can see. This is basically the result of this process. If you leave this model to self-condition on the features of its own VAE to give a technical explanation, then it will come up with what we called 512 prototypes, meaning visuals, that somehow formed in the process of training. And we ranked those prototypes by the factor was basically finding the one that was most similar to the biggest number of other images. And the one that turned out the strongest prototype, so to speak, in this kind of contest was this one. And I mean, yes, it was kind of surprising to me. Of course, all the other prototypes, which you can see cited here as well, none of them can be described properly, I guess, using any kind of visual or existing verbal language. But of course, I was most fascinated by this kind of token here that turned out to be the most attractive prototype in our model. And I think, honestly, it is a token, a coin with two eyes, and I call it a surveillance token. And if you distill down the public sphere inside an image generator according to its own features, at this point, what you end up with is a surveillance token. And I think that's a pretty interesting finding, because it relates to many things that have been written recently in terms of how do machine learning models process, compress, distill, patch, and tokenize knowledge. And of course, we know it is a process of tokenization technically, but people have, Warren, for example, or Leonardo Impet and Fabian Offert have described it as basically compressing units of knowledge so they become commensurable and exchangeable as small as possible units of what is called neural exchange value. So what you can see here basically are neural exchange coins or neural exchange tokens, which somehow seem to form the substrate of our image generator. And of course, you know, I mean, I'm not an engineer, but it makes me think of many other times that coins have entered thought, philosophy. I'm now excluding Marx. I know there's enough basically specialists for that in the audience, but already before, you know, Hegel came up with the idea that truth is not a coin which can just be handed over and exchanged. Nietzsche came up with the idea that basically the exchange value of language and communication are metaphors which are overused to the point that their denomination, and with the denomination also the power systems behind them, become invisible, or they just drop from consciousness. But I think most people, and then, of course, including Marx, the whole political economy, the theory of value and of circulation have made it clear that value is, of course, a thing, a condensed entity that speaks of social relation. And the thing that we have here is almost in parallel to Palantier's idea of the seeing stone. It is a seeing coin. And why is it a seeing coin? Because it is surveilling its users. And it also speaks about a new kind of capital, maybe, which one could very, very, very tentatively call recursive or back-propagating capital, since it exists in the area of machine learning models which produce outputs via those mechanisms of recursivity and backpropagation. We can also, I don't know, interpret here, if we want to read it desperately, that attention, of course, and the gaze are main components of this kind of currency exchange capital system, which is also expressed in technical language in machine learning in many different ways. The credit assignment problem, for example, is something that is being talked about very often in terms of backpropagation, which is designed to lower the loss function across the system. Okay, I have some even more wild conclusions from that, but I'm going to spare you all of these. But I think all of this begs the question, which I cannot and do not want to go into right now. What kind of capital is it? Or what is the new in this form of machine learning mediated or compressed capital? Question mark, I don't know. And how does it basically in its lift, in its tendency to abstract more and more from anything outside its own system of reference, how does it leave basically human knowledge behind? How does it leave labor behind? How does it leave reproduction behind? And in my case now, how does it even leave my own human body behind? Because, the heat wave is, I don't have to go into this right now, but it is, of course, a side effect of energy waste, a lot of energy waste, as we could demonstrate using our very modest machine learning experiments. A lot of this waste is completely unnecessary technically, since you could also make machine learning models which operate on much less energy. Really up to 70, 80% less. But what does it mean if basically the body or bodies completely get left behind in this kind of process of lift, of abstraction, of uncoupling from any sort of referent? What kind of circulation is it even? And if I may go back to my earlier example from my film in Kurdistan, the one about the micro workers and the journalist that got bombed by a drone. Rebin Karim, when I was talking to him, it's the name of the journalist, he hadn't been able to go out from his house for many months because he was kind of afraid that he would get targeted again. And one way, at least for him, in other territories that's no longer possible, was not to leave the house. Because it was unlikely that the whole house would get bombed, as would certainly happen in Gaza or in other places. And another, let's say, possibility for people to escape drones or aerial bombardments has been to retire into caves. I was in a cave, which is actually a cave for a Neanderthal burial in South Kurdistan, where people have lived for 40,000 years, and they keep retiring into the cave with every war to escape this kind of the lift and the abstract gaze of aerial warfare and now drone warfare. So what do we do if the body stays down in the cave, down in the basement, and basically its neurocognitive capital gets abstracted into this kind of, seeing coin? I'm going to stop here with these questions. I hope you are doing well. I have no idea where you are or whether you could hear anything of what I was saying, but all the best. Stay cool. Thank you.
Okay, Hito, we have some questions for you, I think. Is that okay? From the audience.
Oh, we can try.
Okay. Do you have the mic? Do you have a mic?
And
Does this work? Okay, who has a question? Any questions from the audience for Hito? Here from Moore Nidek. Oh, sorry. Anyone have a question for Hito? Anyone from the audience online have a question? Okay, we have a question from the audience.
Thank you so much for sharing your very interesting work. I know you said that it is still a work in progress. I'm curious what you see as the end application of the public domain image generation model you're building. Do you see this as an art piece, as a piece of scientific research, or some other domain? Where do you see it going?
I think at this point there will be several outcomes. Just reacting to my. So we are going to release a check as public service that functions as a default image generator. Once we have identified the best means to do it, and then we are going also to have all these completely experimental checkpoints, which are absolutely not optimized for performance, but for process, and basically that function as proof of concept or concept of proof maybe. It's some kind of conceptual process, subtractive process, and we'll just see where that goes. And that will be a series of other checkpoints. We also have a quantum filter line of inquiry, and there will also be basically checkpoints released in respect to that at some point.
Nidek?
Hi, Hito. How are you? I first of all want to say one thing, which is that I see visually a connection to Trevor Paglen's work in the exhibition, The World Through AI, in terms of this kind of monstrosity. I mean, for me, there's a kind of monstrosity. So then the question becomes, this image that we're seeing, is it, when you reduce this, the process of this AI calculation, this kind of, the prompts and the things you were showing us that are in red that have been removed in the number 12, the slide 12. Is it possible, going back to my relationship to Trevor Paglen's work, are you also removing checks and balances to computational AI hallucination?
Yes and no. I mean, the process is different from Trevor because he explicitly trained his guns on certain concepts. He didn't wait for the concepts to emerge basically as out of the training process itself. Okay, now I don't hear my echo. I think I can just, okay. Are checks and balances being removed? Yes, or there are possibilities removed of steering generation process via language. But then again, you have other processes to access it, and that's also quite fascinating because we are now working with purely mathematical functions to try to explore our own latent space. It's also pretty fascinating. So basically, it also widens the scope of possibilities, but it removes the possibility of steering it via the means we know already, one of which is language.
Geometrical relationships of the latent spaces that you are kind of, you push the limit of that mathematization of the latent space to such a point that you create what I'd like to say is a kind of AI sublime So I'm arguing that in the idea of Baumgarten, the idea of the sublime from the 19th century, you know, this idea of the sublime as something beautiful but horrible, you're at the edge of a precipice, and how that manifests itself in the history of Romanticism, in the artwork. And I'm wondering here, is that a similar process? Are we looking at a kind of AI sublime? If is there such a thing? Okay, let me quickly just say, question, is there such a thing as the AI sublime?
That's possible, I don't know, but I think our process is different in that what we're trying to go for is arte povere or more than an AI sublime by taking away as many things as possible, right? Just work with whatever is there, which are the public domain data, and just that as much as possible. Another reference, which I think might make sense, but I don't know yet, is a certain kind of minimalism, right? But if I say minimalism, there are so many strands of it. I'm precisely thinking about what Alain Badiou called subtractivism in discussing Malevich's white on white, that things get, or social relations, or whatever you might call them, the whole domain of sensory perception gets distilled into one single line, which creates a difference between white and white. And we are trying to find that line, basically. We are trying to find the line of friction, if you will, by taking away as many things as possible. I'm completely opposed to this idea of sublime, of shock and awe, basically aesthetics of the Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk, of sublimity, if you will. This is not supposed to overwhelm. It is supposed to show the form of compression, to distill the form of compression as a social formalism, as a social form. And it may not look beautiful, and it doesn't. I mean, this coin is really horrible, but it is the most compressed form of what we were able to get right now. And I think we can go further even. And as I said, all of this is very, very preliminary, right? So don't take it as a naked coin.
Okay, great. Martha Schwendener has a question for us.
Hi, thank you. It was a wonderful talk, and I really love these also ideas of subtraction and responsibility. But the one term also for anyone familiar with your work is hearing invisibility and visibility, and of course it makes one think of how not to be seen. Your earlier work, and I'm just wondering what your ideas are, if they have or haven't changed around visibility and invisibility as you've moved into working with AI as opposed to some of your earlier works.
As I try to do in mechanical curves, or by formalist interventions like the one we're trying now. And, this is an open process. And I think in this we are much more like engineers, honestly, because I don't have an aesthetic preference right now. I'm just trying all the things. And I'm, whatever it is we get, we take at face value, so to speak, and we try to make sense of it.
Tariq Krim, thank you so much.
I have a question. It's just an observation, but what I found fascinating with the images, and especially the one in public domain, it's that, as you know, there's a huge debate right now about how is the general culture around the world been harvested by all these large companies to produce commercially grade LLM, meaning that the objective is to actually make images that look good or like fit in, the narrative of the moment, so you can illustrate a post that actually has been written by an AI and basically nobody's really going to read. But what I found fascinating with these images is that, in a way, you're translating visually why they had to do all this harvesting, because in a way, if you don't have access to all that, intellectual property, all the music, all the pictures, everything has been, I call it harvested because there's a debate: is it been stolen? Is it been imitated? But the point is that when I look at this especially this image of public domain, it suddenly I had a realization that without everything, that's where they're getting to, this kind of aesthetic. And if they want to go to the aesthetic they're trying to reach out, that is the commercial aesthetic, then they literally have to include all of that. So it was the first time that I kind of feel like the question is the fact that all of its data has been harvested over the last 5 years, funneled through Common Crawl and all these things. It's the same thing for text, but for visual and latent space, it's more even visible. Is that that's what they needed. So when they say we don't really need the culture, we just it's actually not true, because if you don't, then you come to an aesthetic that is not humanly satisfied, and you're basically showing us the difference between the two stage, and why it affects. It was just an observation. Maybe I'm in the wrong, but I was just wanted to say that.
No, this is a staunch public domain aesthetic. And it is what happens if you distill the public domain through Pix art alpha model. And what I'm trying to say is, for me, it's not ugly at all. For me, the pseudo photorealistic simulations of VO are really ugly, and of, I don't know, what is called nano banana, etc. That's horrible. That's really awful. Here we get to something which is awkward and weird, but it shows social forms, at least, May not be aesthetically pleasant.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we could continue with earlier we had some questions between Tariq, Agnieszka, and David. Do we want to continue to that line of questioning at all with Hito? No. No. Okay, we'll save that for the round table. So let's give a big hand to Hito. Thank you so much.